All right, well, welcome everybody to our first Food for Thought seminar of fall 2021. We are so excited today to be hosting Lynn Exner from Canada Action. She'll be talking today about whether or not resource advocacy and activism has to be confrontational, which I think is a huge thing for young people and students. So we are so excited to have you, Lynn.
Thanks, Perry. I'm happy to be here. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm currently coming to you from Toronto, which is the traditional lands of the Mississaugas and the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, as well as the Wendat. So it's great to be here. I also want to acknowledge, as always, the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit from coast to coast to coast here in Canada. So excited to be here. Thanks for having me. So the conversation today, as Perry said, does advocacy have to be confrontational to be effective? And so really want to get into the idea of the importance of listening in a polarized world. And so the word advocacy very often is linked in with also the concept of activism. So I think it's important that we kind of talk about the difference between those two, because Canada Action, where I work, is an advocacy space, but we also do activism. And SFC, I would say, is primarily an advocacy organization. And so the two kind of get mixed up, but they both kind of come back to a different role in being effective in social justice issues, which is, whatever it is that we each care about. So when it comes to activism, I would say that, this is the use of direct and public methods to try to bring about change, especially social and political, that you and people who feel the same as you want. So an activist is going to be someone who is going to be doing public protests, maybe demonstrations, actually actively going out and talking to a lot of people and telling them what they think about a certain issue. So yes, you're working on social activists and political issues, and that really matters, but often it's a personal time space. You're putting yourself out in public. And I think the other important component of an activist is that you are doing a lot of transmitting of information. I'm going to tell you what I think about this. I'm going to make sure my voice is heard. I think it's important that I stand up and stand proud. So this is, to borrow from an old Winston Churchill quote, it takes courage to stand up and be heard, right? Okay, well, that's great. But the other half of that same Winston Churchill quote is that it also takes courage to sit down and listen. And I probably should have put that quote up. But so I think that activists and advocacy are sort of the two sides of that. It takes courage to stand up and speak your mind and share your thoughts, but it also takes courage to sit down and listen to what someone else has to say. And I think that's the advocacy side when we're looking at any kind of social justice issues. So to be an advocate is, yes, still to speak, but I think the focus becomes a lot on listening and on learning. So you're going to bring attention to an injustice, whatever you deem to be an injustice, which of course we'll talk about soon is not always consistent, but you're working on identifying solutions. And I think this is the key part, inviting all parties to listen to each other's problems. So there's sort of two sides in my mind to the same coin. I think some people are more attracted to one form of taking action than others. I personally think that both of them have a place, even if I don't always agree with the activism and advocacy that everybody does. And I don't think we're intended to. But advocacy, I think, really important to publicly support an idea and trying to find, again, sort of solutions. So to this point, as you're listening, I would ask you to think of, when you think of activism and advocacy, what comes to mind? Because I think very often most people just think of activism. So to run through a few examples, I'm going to try to stay and just give a few examples broadly, but focus primarily on resource activism because that's our space. Of course, there's many, many issues that people are working on, but within Canada in particular, we deal with a lot of resource spaces, and that's our mandate at Canada Action. So some quick examples: Trans Mountain Pipeline. When I was younger and when I was the same age as you guys, no one ever talked about pipelines. It just was not the kind of thing that mattered or that came up. But in the last 3 or 4 years, in our national landscape, the Trans Mountain Pipeline has been very important. And a lot of people across the country hold a wide variety of opinions on this. And I'm not here today to say which one is right or which one is wrong, but I'm asking you, when you look at the things around Trans Mountain, most of what we see in the news, in mainstream media, is what I would consider activism. Here you have different people on different sides. Some of you will recognize are are rallies that we have had on Canada Action side, the I Love Oil and Gas and Time to Build Trans Mountain, but equally there are people on the other side. And in those cases, really, it was a large group of people gathered together to try to say, here's what I believe, and just spreading their voice. Okay, but I would say this is activism. Question for you to think about: are the people in this group in this situation, are they listening? You know, are they trying for unity, or are they more polarized in this case? One of the big pieces to kind of come up with for me to think about today is the idea of, is this a me versus you situation, or is this an us versus the problem situation? So as a concept for you to think about when it comes to activism and advocacy. Here's another example. This is the Wet'suwet'en Coastal Gas Link. So those of you who follow the news will remember that just prior to COVID, in February of 2020, our entire nation was in large part shut down by rail blockades related to the Coastal GasLink pipeline, and then also specifically to Indigenous rights. And you'll see some of these signs saying we support Wet'suwet'en. And so while this might look, one-sided, I just remind you, would it interest you to know that when I see signs like solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en, a question I always ask is like, well, which Wet'suwet'en are you in solidarity with? Because there's a lot of people that are Wet'suwet'en and they don't all hold the same beliefs, just like not all Canadians hold the same beliefs. And is it right for some people to be saying, I want to support, the independence of hereditary chiefs to make a decision? Of course, that's right. Is it right for workers who work on the pipeline to say, I want to support my right to work and to build a good job and a strong community and to have a decent lifestyle for my family? Of course, I think that's great. When we say respect Indigenous people's rights, going back to UNDRIP, there's a lot of pieces there. And that includes not only the right to say no to projects like a pipeline, but also the right to say yes. So let's just remind ourselves that the elected councils of all 20 nations along the Coastal GasLink all said that they were in favor of this pipeline. So do we respect their decision, or do we respect that of other community members who maybe are in disagreement? And so just like every other part of the world, it's sort of two sides. So other examples: Nova Scotia, Mi'kmaq lobster dispute. Here you have Indigenous that want the right to say yes to natural resource development and to use their treaty rights to make a moderate living and therefore fish for lobster all season long. And were they right to try to engage in those rights? I think that they are, and it's worth being activist about. But then on the other side, you have other lobster fishermen who also have a very strong right to say we have fishing seasons for a reason, and that we have to respect some of these pieces. So my point here is that when you're doing activism, often there's a lot of people with different ideas, but they're not either right or wrong. Last one I'll kind of bring up, the more recent one here, Fairy Creek, BC, to do with logging. And here again, this is old growth logging, and you have people on different sides. In this case, the gentleman in the middle, Elder Bill Jones, is one of the Pashadat, and he is firmly against oil tree logging. But you also have the two elected chiefs in that area and their elected council, democratically elected, who are in favor. And so again, it's not simple, it's not complex. So activism, it kind of comes back to this, because I think we go back to the idea, are we listening? And sometimes, this slide is in here just because I think a lot of times we just get into this polarized. It's very, very extreme. Kids against extinction. Oil equals death, water equals life. It's always very binary. It's my way, which is the right way, and your way, which is the wrong way. And the reality, of course, as we just went through several examples, is that's almost never the case. So going back to the idea of listening, is this effective? To be an activist is to speak. To be an advocate is to listen, was a quote by a young person, in the United States through a lot of the BLM places, but I think it still applies here. And so let's talk about listening. The biggest communication problem is that we do not listen to understand, we listen to reply. And this has been attributed to several different people. Probably Stephen Covey is one that people have heard of that have said this. But when someone is speaking to you in a situation that might be a debate or polarizing, are you listening to understand what they're trying to tell you? As if you were at one of those rallies or protests, were you there to say, hey, I'm really curious about what you think and why you're on the other side of this issue? If you want to choose sides, then I am. Or are you simply listening to find where are they going to make a mistake? Where's there going to be a weakness in their logic? Where are you going to find a flaw and be like, aha, I gotcha. You're wrong. I was right all along. So I think that the listening piece and truly listening to try to understand is something that's sort of been missing. And I think it's an important thing for us to come back to as SFC is looking to be, of course, advocates. So one of the pieces that I just wanted to make mention of is the idea of confirmation bias, which you may have heard of, but it's the tendency to search for and to focus in on those things that currently like to support what you believe. So if I see a piece in the news and it aligns with what I already believe, I will validate it, I will share it, I will continue to kind of push that around. If I see something that goes against what I believe, then typically the human behavior is, and we all do this to a certain extent, is to say, well, that guy doesn't know what he's talking about. They're wrong. And some people will just, they won't even need to look at what is being said. They'll just see the source and say, well, nothing that person says can possibly be of value. So confirmation bias is sort of an important part in this whole idea of, do we listen? Because if I'm talking to somebody who I have a preconceived notion that they think differently than I do, that they must be wrong, and it's so interesting that when someone thinks to say, I find, and this actually goes back to sort of behavioral theory, is that typically humans, when we hear of somebody saying that something someone has that they don't agree with, this is our first thought. Oh, well, they just don't know. So if I can just give them all my information and enlighten them about all the things that I know, surely they will see things my way. And if any of you have ever tried to convince maybe a brother or a sister or a mother or father that if they only knew what you knew, that they would be right, and tell me how much success you've had in that. Sometimes it works because you have sort of that trust base. But for the most part, I think that we still believe what we believe. It's human nature. So if we just think, okay, if I just tell them, they'll learn. And if they don't learn, then the next response is normally, well, frankly, they're an idiot. They just don't understand the science. They haven't read all the things. They don't get it. They're looking at the wrong data. They're ignorant, but in that sort of negative, antagonistic way. And so that's the next default space. And then if you kind of say, well, actually, this person is highly accredited, they're an expert in their field, they have published in journals and peer reviews or anything else like that. As humans, we still refuse to believe. And so then the next possible plausible thing is that they're evil. They just simply are evil people who are now plotting against us with all their knowledge, and they don't care that the information that they have is inaccurate. They simply are trying to, put profits in advance, don't care about people, etc. And what I always notice is that very rarely do people consider one of two things, which is one, maybe they are right and I'm right. Is that possible? And then the second thing is maybe I'm wrong, And most humans never get to that point. If you listen to discussions, it just never really gets there. It's not a piece we like to consider. And even though all of us, I can ask people and be like, yeah, do you think that sometimes they make mistakes? Oh, sure, I do. Have you been wrong? And I think in theory, we all think that we make mistakes. But ask yourself right now, what of your beliefs are wrong right now? Like, what are you wrong about? And very few of us will be able to actually say, well, actually, I'm wrong about this, because if you did, you would have changed your mind. And so you're never actually wrong. So anyway, it's just this kind of interesting little sort of self-feeding loop. So can we be wrong? And I think this comes up in activism again, because I'll watch a lot of videos of people who have different beliefs than me trying to learn what it is they're trying to tell me. But I hear words sometimes like, we need to demand that they do the right thing. And we need to, do the right thing and get into, public office or whatever it is to make sure the right thing is done. And the question I'm always asking is, well, how do you know it's the right thing? And so there's a gentleman, a philosopher in the United States by the name of Jonathan Haidt, and he goes on about a bunch of things, but I would encourage you to take a look. He's got this thing of, the coddling of the American mind is, I think, one of his books or something to that point. But, one of the things that he talks about is that this binary belief that everybody is either good or bad. You are either, you're evil or you're good. And you are either right and you're with me, or you're wrong and you're against. And I think that binary thinking is very dangerous. So I'm always curious, what is this right thing? And typically, frankly, that one is ascribed to sort of the environmental side of our spaces, where they demand that they do the right thing. Whereas I would say that typically what I see on the pro-resource side, and I think that it also merits a lot of caution and concern, is, well, we need to teach them how the world actually works. And so the moral high ground is, sort of the purview of one side, and then the like pragmatic, economic, we actually understand things. We're not driven by emotions is on the other side. And again, this demonstrates a pure lack of listening. And it doesn't, going back to the original sort of thesis, does it have to be confrontational? Well, if we come in to any kind of space, a problem like climate action, a huge issue, or like natural resource development or jobs and economic strength within Canada, if you come at it with this polarized side of, well, I'm going to make you do the right thing, or I'm going to teach you how the world really works, is that a great starting point for actually finding that middle ground? So, Aristotle, this is again, whether he wrote this down or not, who knows, but often attributed to him, it's the mark of an educated mind to entertain a thought without necessarily having to accept it, which just means that you're open minded. The actual belief of being open minded, which I think is a value that we need to sort of redefine and re-accept, that I'm open to listening to you, that it's okay for me to be wrong. I wish that people would pursue the idea that being wrong isn't bad. Being closed-minded maybe is the bigger challenge. And that as you learn that you are incorrect about something, that just means growth. That means knowledge. That means that you have expanded your space. And as a person who studied, was in sciences for the first 12 years of my career, the idea behind science is that we will always evolve our theories. We will always realize that what we thought before is no longer accurate as we get more information. And I think that that's a concept we could bring into activism advocacy. So moving around, not only is the question is, can we say that we're wrong, but can we maybe both be right, is the other side of that piece. And as an advocate against injustice, I think it becomes not that you're wrong and I'm right, but maybe we just have different priorities. And so different perspectives. I know this is a very old looking kind of thing, but I think it still illustrates the point, right? So here's two people having this shouting match, both firmly convinced that they are correct. And quite frankly, just because you're right doesn't mean that I'm wrong. And you maybe just haven't seen it from my side. And I go back to the examples I started with. I don't think that it's wrong for an individual First Nation to say yes or no to a resource project. I don't think it's wrong for a person to want to defend their jobs and their family and to know that the work they're doing, while maybe not understood by other people, is ethical, moral, and fantastic for a lot of reasons and does a lot of good, but it's again from their perspective. So moving along in Canada, I see this all the time. I've had the great privilege of actually going from coast to coast, not quite to coast, but into the territories. And it's interesting how even in different places, things are different. If you take to Newfoundland, for example, where you have oil and gas together has been the great economic savior for their places, which isn't to say that every Newfoundland and Labradorian is in favor of oil and gas again, but as an economy there, they're very much in favor of offshore oil and gas development. Go to the other side of the country, and where oil and water meet in BC, it's the proverbial oil and water, right? It's the last thing that they want to do, and they're super against it. These are both Canadian communities with far more in common than they have different, but that is a strict difference. And so again, their perspectives are maybe different. I'm from Saskatchewan, and the mining of uranium is a huge part of our economy and has just not only worked for the communities themselves, but as a person who spent a lot of time working with not-for-profits, I would say that the uranium companies and mining has almost single-handedly helped get all the not-for-profits and different communities and all those other social justice things that we do in Saskatoon, where I'm from. Like Cameco was my first go-to, right? And the second was nutrients. So there's a lot of importance there, and we understand that. But there's nothing to do with nuclear. They're very afraid of nuclear power development. Move to Ontario. And Ontario and Bruce Power and the nuclear that supplies every single day at least 50%. Today I looked earlier, 67% of the power in Ontario came from nuclear. A lot of people don't know this. And it's actually the single reason that Canada's overall emissions is so low is because of the combination of nuclear and our abundant hydropower. So you have two places, both Canadian, both that rely in many ways on some of these natural resources, but a very huge difference in thought. So again, can we both be right? So going back to the idea, confrontational, when we think about this, is it you versus me, or is it us versus the problem? And I think that the only way to get to that point is to be actual advocates, which again, I kind of go back and quote, to be an advocate is to listen. And it's to listen to the other person, not with the intent to catch them in an aha moment, not to then reply with your more clever argument, but to actually learn from them. Why is it that you think differently? You're a smart person who I respect in many ways. It could be a family member. Often this is something that the people that you love and respect in every other way, you have a difference here. Can we learn to listen? And I think this is important when it goes back to climate, because this is the IPCC United Nations piece here. I think that we all agree that there is a real call to action to reduce our emissions. And that's an important value. But there are other values that are also important. And how do we prioritize and say that's the only one that matters? Well, the United Nations itself will say you've got the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And that also includes the right to say yes to economic development. So if a First Nation wants to do a coal mine development, how does that work with the climate change? Or furthermore, a just transition, which says that it's really important for people to have like good clean energy and quality jobs. So which of these things is more important? The United Nations themselves puts out a list of the 17 sustainable development goals, and they'll tell you that they're not in an order, that one is more important than the other, but they also kind of had to choose an order. And most people are surprised to see that climate action is 13 on that list, whereas access to decent work is 8 and access to affordable energy is 7. So if you want to make these decisions on my value is more important than yours, I just think it's too binary, it's too black and white. So to kind of get to some of the endpoints here, I know my time is wrapping up. There are 2 parts to advocacy. It's vocalizing, it's standing and speaking, but the one other point I want to bring is also the idea of amplifying, where I see activism as this is my feelings, my opinion, what matters to me, and I want you to hear it. And it's a whole lot of outward. I think that advocacy and part of the listening is also choosing to amplify the right voices. So not just my voice. And I'll just say in the work that we do with a lot of Indigenous economic development, especially, there's a lot of concern that on both sides of the coin, Indigenous voices are often being used just further, speaking to some of the systemic issues that they face. But on both sides of the issue, they're being used as a tool to advance one side or the other. And I just would caution people to kind of say that, like every other community, in my experience, you're going to have Indigenous on this side and on that side, and for a variety of reasons. And again, it kind of comes back to let's try to listen and sort of see what it is that people are trying to do. So, with that, I think, can Canadians work together to sort of solve the middle of the riddle? Can we move from a me versus you to a me and you versus the problem? And I think that when we have these confrontational, polarizing pieces, they have a place. I think that some civil disobedience has always been a catalyst for change and some of the best change that we have in our society. But I also think it's a very dangerous space, and that it also is a breeding ground for misinformation, for groupthink, for polarization, and for animosity, where again, that confirmation bias, no matter what you say, you're wrong, and therefore you're an evil person. And only if you're on my side can you be right. And I think that really just stops us from advancing any of the actual goals we're trying to get along. So to go back to the very end, then, can it be effective if it is confrontational? I think we've seen that it is effective by some measures. I also think in many cases it holds things at a standstill. My personal belief is that as long as we have one group that is, in the example of fossil fuels, that is just no fossil fuels now, ever, keep it in the ground, and another group that is all on the we need them for forever, so here we go. As long as they're not looking towards the middle and saying, well, actually, we need climate action. What we need is to reduce emissions, but we also need to keep jobs and finding the sort of and the people, planet, prosperity that you guys have at SFC would be great. And I think the way to do that, that was just actually a rally that I had where I actually spent the entire rally with people on the other side, agreeing with as much as I could. So that was a time where I tried to really listen. I was like, tell me what your most important point is. And they would say, we need to reduce emissions. And I'd be like, great, totally agree. And that was sort of shocking for them that somebody on the other side would issue. And they'd be like, and we need to, and it's important that Canada be a leader in reducing our emissions and everything else. Yeah, totally agree. And then there was parts, of course, we disagreed, whereas we're still using it, etc. But there was real proof to me that people who were very antagonistic to start, there was sort of an olive branch extended. And I think that SFC does a great job of that. I think SFC is a great place to be advocates, where it is, trying to both be activists in terms of I want to let our voice be heard, but also asking questions, doing surveys, and I think part of the best part, if you have a chance to see this video, how to have hard conversations, sort of a sampling of SFC's great discussions of young professionals and bright minds from coast to coast to coast, having these hard conversations in a way where they are genuinely modeling listening. And I think that's the best thing about SFC, is that we need to be reminded that if we aren't going to listen as advocates, the solutions probably won't come. And so if you guys keep up doing the great work that you're doing, I think you'll be doing a real service to the country. So I thank you guys for that. So with that, I'll call it quits.
Wonderful. Thank you, Len. I love the riddle of the middle. It's just so catchy. And I think it really emphasizes that point that we're all working toward the same thing, really. We just have, numerous ways of getting to it. And so with that said, we'll take questions from Justice and Caitlin. Justice, are you ready?
Yeah, I just have the one question. So, what I was going to ask is, so do you think that one of the reasons we have so much trouble finding common ground, like you said, like is it you versus me, or is it you and me versus the problem? And I think that's a really good question to ask. Do you think the reason we have trouble finding common ground is because so many of our problems have become political issues and not just issues that we should tackle together?
Well, I mean, I think part of it too is just the way we communicate now. And I think that the way that people get their information, frankly, is a bigger piece of the puzzle, as opposed to is it political or not. So yes, some things that prior I said pipelines were just boring things that transmitted the heat to a lot of people's glass. And we have pipelines for water. We have pipeline is just a road for liquids, So when you're opposing pipelines, you're opposing a road. Now I can understand the product that might go in there might be good or bad, but for those people who are very much pushing for hydrogen as the next great source for energy that could be great energy, fantastic. Guess how you're going to get your hydrogen, people? It's going to come through pipelines. So if you build a pipeline, maybe you're going to change that pipeline to be, so that's sort of a separate piece. So I think it's less about sort of the practical stuff that has become politicized in a way that I think would have been found very odd, even 10 years ago. But for me, the bigger piece is just how are we consuming information? And so people will make the decision. That goes back to your confirmation bias. So some people will look at different news outlets and they will just decide that's a left outlet, that's a right outlet. This one says things that are correct. This one is all hoax. And I'm going to use the United States because that keeps me outside of the political sphere here. But, where you have CNN and you have Fox, whichever one you more regularly turn on as a station says a lot about you and really changes how you're getting information. And then furthermore, for your entire generation, certainly, and the ones to come after, the actually consuming from a direct mainstream media space is not happening. I mean, I think podcasts are giving people far more information. I think that a lot of people my age and younger don't look at the news anymore. And especially after COVID, a lot of people just said, you know what, I'm done with the news. Like I'm tapped out. I can't do that anymore. And so they're just getting their feeds through their peers. And so that's a good self-care space, but it also leads you to only getting information vetted and curated by people who think the same as you. And it's really hard in this sort of, as they refer to as post-truth world. I don't know that it's post-truth. I just think, and even with COVID, we continue to isolate ourselves further into our circles. So that to me is the biggest problem, is how can we not only normalize, being wrong is a question for me. Like it's okay to be wrong, like make mistakes faster and be open to that and recognize that when you're wrong, it's because you had the benefit, the privilege of having someone give you more information. And you are open-minded enough to say, oh, look at that. I didn't know that. Or even if you don't say you're wrong, you can just say, I'm 6 and you're 9. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you're right and I'm right, and go with the and. So that to me is probably the bigger focus that I'd like to see as a shift for Canadians.
That makes sense for sure. I think it's that conscious effort, right, by all of us to challenge ourselves to meet people and to absorb news that is maybe outside of what we're normally drawn to, because then we're finding that, the truth is so multifaceted. So with that said, Caitlin, do you have something you'd like to ask?
I do. You talked about the idea of advocacy and amplifying, and I really liked that. I was wondering, when you're talking about amplifying voices, do you think that advocacy is the first step in that, listening and understanding, and then learning how to step back? Or should we amplify first?
Well, again, I don't think there's ever a yes or no, black and white binary, right? I mean, I think for some people, the first step is simply getting educated, because there are a lot of people who I know, even your own members, I've seen some of the videos. They would feel a certain way about an issue and they would just know it inside. And this is true on all sides of the spectrum. Sometimes you just feel a certain way and you don't necessarily know why. So you feel challenged in trying to defend that until you get yourself educated with some talking points and feel really comfortable and solid, because these are difficult conversations and they're scary sometimes to have unless you feel like you've got all the whatever kind of arsenal you need to kind of get through that. So education's a big piece, and that's why I think that even the little snippets of what's being done again by SFC on your social media is great. I think the other thing too is just let's just normalize these conversations, right? Let's not make them that when you have this, that everyone immediately is like, whoa, they just brought that up, like, are we really going to go down that path, or can we just have a nice evening here, auntie? So is that, so I think that normalizing that piece is going to be an important part. And then in terms of amplifying, I think that it's just, whether it's sharing someone's like, you know what, you and I sitting at this dinner table, we all agree, but you know what, I had a great conversation with my neighbor Gloria down the street. You all know Gloria, and Gloria told me this, and I had just never thought of that before. I think that is amplifying just a diversity of voices. And for me, again, let's just go back to for an Indigenous piece, I think that's really important. I always try to be careful to say I don't speak on behalf of Indigenous because I'm not Indigenous. However, I do like to amplify those voices. I think it's a big part of allyship for a lot of other social justice pieces. I think this is fairly common space right now, is that you want to share those stories and also, again, normalize and make it safe for people to have a diversity of thought.
Yeah, and you use the word normalize, and I think for a lot of us too, it's about practice, right? Like realizing that these conversations get more and more comfortable the more often we're willing to engage with them. And I know, like, I walk into things with a bunch of talking points prepared because it helps me feel like I know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So I think the final question for you, Lynn, is um, what kind of role do you think students and young people have in advocacy, and how can we contribute to the narrative?
Well, I mean, you really are just finding the narrative right now. I think that if you look in the media, when I look and see whose voices are the loudest, they might not always care. They carry a sort of a different weight. I think that everyone recognizes now that it is your space to just define what's happening next, and that you need to be. You're going to be most impacted by the policies that are determined today. You're going to be carrying the burdens of the decisions of the past, as well as and sharing in all the good things from the past that you guys can have, that you have this wonderful lifestyle. So I think it's important to kind of take action. I think also, kind of going back to advocacy, it's not also just about activism. Like, I think what you guys are doing at SFC, learning to have these hard conversations, this is not just the purview of social justice, right? So I think I spent quite a few years in business, and some of my best mentors would say things like, you know what, Lynn, a good contract or a good deal is when everybody leaves and gets about 70% of what they wanted. And so we always talk in business about a win-win. And deals don't happen if they aren't a win-win. It's just understood. So even if it's sort of a hostile type takeover, there still needs to be ultimately a win of some sort for almost everybody involved. And I think that mindset, that I'm not going to get 100% of what I want, and that you're not going to get 100% of what you want, Caitlin Perry justice, but that I'm going to look for the things we have in common. And we probably agree on a lot more than we disagree on. So let's exhaust. That's another great mentorship piece I had, which was exhaust all the things you agree on when you're trying to get a deal done. Well, we agree on this and this and this and this. And just psychologically, if you get to that point, everyone feels like that, we're so invested in this. We have so much in common. How can we possibly turn this away now? And then the pieces that you don't agree on become so much easier. So this is in business, this is in relationships. You're negotiating where your next vacation might be with somebody, or how to spend your budget. I think that these are important skills that, yes, we're seeing them play out in a national field there. But you guys can learn those pieces, not just for the social justice parts, but for all the other important sort of conversations you're going to have in your lives. And I'll just kind of finish on this. I think this SFC does a great job of that, because going back to your point, Carrie, of normalizing, I think simply for me, when I listen to your peers having these Canadians talking to Canadians conversations, and sharing that, even if I'm not comfortable having those conversations myself, or if you don't have the information, listen to a few of those. And it helps, that's how we learn, is through stories. So basically you're listening to stories of people telling their different opinions, and it'll normalize it for you, even if you don't have the time or motivation to go and have some of these hard conversations with other people. So anyway.
Very cool. All right. Well, I think that's about all the time we have for today. But thank you, Lynn, so much for your time. We so appreciate it. And these are definitely some skills we will have to keep in mind as we, progress through our adult lives. And thank you to Caitlin and Justice for your thoughtful questions. And thanks everybody else for watching. So take care, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.